Our first speaker is Professor Karima Bonouni. Karima and I met, I think, last time we were together was in Korea, in Jeju, at the United Cities and Local Governments Culture Summit. But Karima is the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And she's been doing amazing work in that post around the world, addressing the right to culture and the issue of cultural rights. I can make a plug for Karima's Twitter feed, which is among the good ways to find out what she's been up to around the world with her UN remit. And I think it's a fitting transition from the opening segment that we had to Karima's perspective on the question.
I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, all of the sponsoring organizations behind the Climate Heritage Mobilization, and the individual organizers of this event for their hard work to focus our attention on the impact of climate change on the human right to access and enjoy cultural heritage, amongst all the other important human rights impacts to be addressed here in San Francisco this week. And I thank the organizers in particular for inviting me to take part. Because I really salute and endorse this necessary endeavor, and it's a true honor to be a part of it. In the summit this week in San Francisco, we are coming together to face critical responsibilities as human beings and as human-created institutions for nothing less than the preservation of human life as we know it, including human cultures, in the face of climate change. As Navi Pillai, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said, climate change is one of the most serious challenges humanity has ever faced. My primary messages in the short time that I have this morning are two. The first is that the impact of climate change on cultural heritage is, above all else, a question of human rights, and it needs to be understood and responded to as such. And the second key message is that cultural heritage is not only a potential victim of climate change, but it is also an important resource to prevent and address the challenges caused by this phenomenon in a human rights respecting manner. I entirely support the call of my former colleague, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, John Knox, for international recognition, similar to that in regional instruments, of the human right to a healthy environment. He has further explained, as you see here, that a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights. Without such an environment, we are unable to fulfill our aspirations or even live at a level commensurate with minimum standards of human dignity. And as I myself will explain in a report to the General Assembly on universality and cultural diversity this coming October, the universality of human rights, including the cultural rights I work on, has no meaning today without a livable environment in which they can be enjoyed. Climate change specifically is also a human rights issue, as Professor Knox has explained in a crucial 2016 report for the Human Rights Council, and that's a report I really recommend to you. Climate change has particular impacts on the human rights of women, children, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and a number of other groups. It often, in fact, has the most drastic effect on the human rights of those who have done the least to contribute to the problem in the first place. Today we focus on this critical intersection between two key human rights issues then, climate change and human rights. The intentional destruction of cultural heritage was the first theme I chose to focus on when I became the Special Rapporteur in November 2015. And I've been determined to take a holistic approach to this issue, looking at situations of war and peace, looking at the actions of state and non-state actors, looking at impacts on tangible and intangible heritage, considering well-publicized attacks but also less well-known events, such as the terrible histories of destruction of the cultural heritage of many indigenous peoples around the world. Climate change today is amongst the greatest threats to cultural heritage, and we must act with determination to respond to this threat. If the UN Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council have taken action to respond to intentional destruction of cultural heritage, including by terrorist groups, and I'm so pleased that they have, but if they have done this, they should likewise act to respond to the threat that climate change now poses to cultural heritage. As noted in an excellent 2014 monograph entitled Climate Change as a Threat to Peace, Impacts on Cultural Heritage and Cultural Diversity, there are a myriad of ongoing and potential impacts. For example, cultural heritage sites face threats from temperature changes, flooding, storms. Natural heritage sites face developments such as glaciers melting and habitat changes. In addition, as this monograph warns, climate change is likely to affect cultural diversity and sociocultural interactions by forcing communities to change their work habits and ways of life, to compete for resources, or to migrate elsewhere. I am greatly alarmed by many studies I was going to cite, but given the shortness of time, I will mention just one 2014 academic study which found that more than 130 World Heritage cultural sites are at long-term risk from sea level rise. And I think this is a very low estimate, but nevertheless very important examples. The sites under threat in this study include the archaeological site of Carthage in Tunisia and India's Elephanta caves. Moreover, we know that climate change is a threat multiplier, which means it magnifies existing threats to cultural heritage, such as fueling conflicts in which heritage destruction may take place. Many people might ask why we should care about the specific issue of the impact of cultural heritage, the impact on cultural heritage, when there are so many other threats posed to human beings and human rights by climate change. And I think the only way to offer a convincing answer to this question is through a human rights approach to cultural heritage. Viewed from a human rights perspective, heritage is important in and of itself, but also in relation to its human dimension, including as an expression of human dignity. The right of access to and enjoyment of cultural heritage forms part of international human rights law, finding its legal basis, amongst other sources, in the right to take part in cultural life, guaranteed both by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 70th anniversary of which we celebrate this year, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, a binding treaty which has 169 state parties in every region of the world. Cultural heritage is a fundamental resource for other human rights also, in particular the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, access to history and a diversity of scientific knowledge as part of the right to education, as well as the economic rights of the many people who earn a living through tourism related to such heritage, and indeed the right to development. It is impossible to separate a people's cultural heritage from the people itself and that people's rights. This is nowhere more evident than in the connection between the destruction of cultural heritage and the destruction of lives, livelihoods, and land. Climate change is having and will continue to have a grave impact on the cultural heritage of all humankind, and hence on the related human rights of millions of human beings. This reality has not been adequately acknowledged in current climate change initiatives. It must be recognized as a matter of international legal obligation and addressed as a priority. In addition, a human rights-based approach requires paying attention to the disparate impact of climate change, which magnifies and is magnified by underlying inequalities. For example, it implies taking a gender-sensitive approach to the protection of cultural heritage, including by recognizing the work of women defenders of cultural heritage and including them in climate processes. Climate change-induced damage and destruction of cultural heritage can have particularly significant effects on indigenous peoples. A human rights-based approach encourages climate change measures and initiatives that recognize and value indigenous knowledge systems, practices, and land care, and also that of other groups of people who work with the land in close interaction with the forest or the water, and who have developed modes of production that are more respectful of the environment and do not contribute to climate change. Another vital aspect of the human rights approach is the emphasis on participation and consultation of affected people, especially those most affected, with regard to policies and responses. It also requires the full involvement of and support for human rights defenders on the front lines who are striving, sometimes at risk of their lives, like Berta Cáceres, to protect human rights and cultural heritage, including from the negative effects of climate change. As the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights explained in a 2009 study, the application of a human rights approach in preventing and responding to the effects of climate change serves to empower individuals and groups who should be perceived as active agents of change and not as passive victims. And I think that is a critical aspect, indeed, of the human rights approach. As I firmly believe, inspired by the motto of the Afghan National Museum, which you see here, a nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. I should say, in my view, its cultures stay alive. The damage and destruction of cultural heritage, when those most closely connected to it are suffering from other severe impacts of climate change, also takes away a key cultural resource that can build resilience and help those people to cope at the very moment when they need such resources the most. I am deeply concerned about the fact that some recent prominent studies of climate heritage have not addressed the human rights implications and have not employed a human rights approach. This is a mistake, and this is a gap which must be filled. As I run out of time, let me say I have spent a great deal of time, both before and since I became Special Rapporteur, listening to women and men talk about the pain and suffering, physical and mental, caused to them and their families by the destruction of cultural heritage to which they have connections. It is critical to listen to their voices and to understand that it is no mere theoretical construct to say that cultural heritage is a human rights issue. This is a lived reality for diverse people around the world. If, as the UN Secretary General has warned this week, governments do not take effective action by 2020 to deal with climate change, we may indeed, as he suggests, be facing a runaway train which will be difficult to stop. And we must consider the human rights impacts, including the cultural rights impacts of this potential runaway train. They will be nothing short of devastating, and the time for action is now. I have a few specific recommendations. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all of them, but in particular, I want to encourage you to consider submitting cases concerning climate heritage to my mandate, to the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, so that we can raise these with governments and further build the human rights jurisprudence in this area. I think that is incredibly important. Placido Domingo once said that cultural heritage is the face of hope. I think this is absolutely true, and I hope that we will come together in hope to protect culture, to protect cultural heritage in the face of climate change, to protect it in all its diversities, and in particular to protect the indispensable ways in which it enables human beings of all kinds to enjoy their internationally guaranteed fundamental human rights. Our work together has only just begun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karima. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Kimmel, who's the Executive Director of the Union of Concerned Scientists. I want to just tell a brief anecdote about UCS. I think, is Aaron Seekamp in the room and Sandra Ftork? Yes? So Aaron, professors Seekamp and Ftork authored a study called Securing the Future of Cultural Heritage by Identifying Barriers to and Strategizing Solutions for Preservation Under Changing Climate Conditions. And so their study looked at some of the barriers to historic preservation professionals taking up climate action. And one of the key barriers they identified is the reality or the perception of inadequate access to climate science. And put another way, if you take any lesson away from today, if you're a historic preservation professional, take away the lesson that you need to know a climate scientist. And fortunately, in North America in particular, but really globally, one of the scientific organizations that stands out among all others in terms of building a bridge to cultural heritage, and in a sense, Ken, I hope I'm not overstating the case, being our climate scientist, is the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I want to especially thank Dr. Brenda Eckwurzel, who you'll hear from later, who's in the room from UCS, and her colleague Adam Markham, who couldn't be here, who have been among the people that have, from the Union of Concerned Scientists, that have had a passion to marry climate science and cultural heritage. And so it's my particular pleasure to be able now to introduce you to the head of the Union of Concerned Scientists, Ken Kimmel.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Anthea and the California Historical Society for hosting us, and thank you, Andrew and Juliana, for putting this great program together. I particularly enjoyed that icebreaker of crumbling up the paper and throwing it in the air. That was great. And I guess before I start, I want to tell you how excited I am to be in the state of California, the state that just 2 days ago showed the entire world how to get serious about climate change. So let's have a round of applause for the state of California. And success, of course, has many fathers and mothers, but I would be remiss in my duty of selling my organization if I didn't tell you that UCS fought tooth and nail to get that bill passed. We mobilized the science community. We had our experts explaining to the legislature that indeed it was possible to run an electric grid on 100% clean energy, and many, many other people worked on this. But I am thrilled to be here and proud of the work of this state, and it couldn't have happened at a better place and at a better time with this week of the Climate Summit. So wonderful, wonderful news. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about why did the Union of Concerned Scientists decide to get involved in cultural heritage issues in the first place? What have we done to help, as Andrew said, marry the worlds of cultural heritage and climate change? And what are some of the things we can do work going forward? So I'll hopefully leave you with some thoughts that you can build on today. Now, UCS has been working on climate change for a very long time, probably about 30 years, and our focus for a lot of that time has been on technology development and policy development to find a way to decarbonize our energy system, our transportation system, and others. But, for us and many people, Hurricane Sandy was a huge, Superstorm Sandy was a big wake-up call, seeing the losses, seeing the devastation. And we knew at that point that we needed to drastically ramp up our climate communications work and make sure that people understood the relationship between these extreme weather events and the losses that they were experiencing and the impacts that they were going to face if we failed to act in time. Now, at that same time, we were very cognizant of the damage to the Statue of Liberty, to the Gateway National Recreation Area, to Ellis Island, and we realized that one of the perhaps great untold stories of climate change is the effects that it will have on the archaeological sites and the buildings and the places that not only Americans but people worldwide care about. And so we decided, as we started to ramp up our climate communications work generally, to focus on the relationship between climate change and cultural heritage in the hopes that we could communicate these impending impacts in a way that resonated with a large audience, an audience of people who love their country and love their places and want to leave that, the beautiful and important areas behind for their kids and their grandkids, and at the same time as broadening the people who care about climate change, perhaps raising their level of intensity and urgency. And so that was our mission. In typical UCS fashion, we tried to advance that mission through analytical reports. So in 2014, we put together a study called Landmarks at Risk, and it looked at how climate change is impacting historic and cultural sites all across the United States, focusing on places like the city of Annapolis, Mesa Verde National Park, and Jamestown in Virginia. And this study got a lot of attention and drew attention, really, to the urgent threat that climate change posed to our cultural heritage. Following that report, we teamed up with UNESCO to do a similar report at the world-wide level, and we documented threats to places like Venice, Yellowstone, and Easter Island. It's clear that climate change is the fastest growing threat to cultural heritage. I think there can be no doubt about that. Rapid sea level rise, worsened storm surges, coastal erosion, wildfires, these, as the previous speaker correctly pointed out, are force multipliers. And I think all of you are aware of some of these places. You can look at Cape Krusenstern in Alaska, or Skara Brae in Scotland, or Rapa Nui in Chile. These are incredibly important historic sites that are being affected right now by climate change. We also had the pleasure in 2014 of teaming up with the historic and cultural preservation community to meet at the Pocantico Conference Center in Tarrytown, New York, to develop a strategy and a call to action to bring these two worlds together to fight as one voice. And I do believe that today's meeting and the launch of this new international network is a direct result of that work that we did in Tarrytown. And one of the things that I can say I'm pleased about this marriage of climate change scientists and cultural heritage is I think we're starting to see, at the local level at least, different parts of the world getting very serious about factoring in cultural heritage in their resilience and adaptation. One particularly gratifying success story is the city of Annapolis. That was one of the cities that we identified as at risk in our 2014 report that really has what's called a Weather It Climate Initiative, which is breaking new ground on how to identify the areas that are most at risk and start planning with community input on how to protect those areas. All the way across the globe, we see a similar thing happening in the city of Hoi An in Vietnam, a World Heritage Site that has more than 1,000 decorated wood buildings. With help of international aid agencies, this city is doing 3D modeling of future flood threats to some of its most important buildings and getting ready for what's going to come. But let me add this, just as it is vital to bring the heritage community to the table when we talk about climate change, it's also vital, and I want to second what Andrew said, that the best and most up-to-date climate science be made available to you. And that's where UCS hopes that we can continue to play a vital role. You will hear later this afternoon from one of our great climate scientists, Brenda Eckwerzel, who will talk in detail about what the upcoming science is and how it should affect the types of work that you do. But I'll just say that we have an upcoming IPCC report that's coming out in October. I think this will be very important for people in this community to understand the implications of that report. There'll also be a national climate assessment here in the United States, which will also elucidate that. And one of our goals in this partnership is to do our best to keep all of you as informed as we can about the scientific standards. I also wanted to point out that the science on attribution is really developing. In the last number of years, scientists have gotten better and better at pinpointing sort of the fingerprint of climate change behind a lot of the disasters that we're experiencing. And that is something else that my colleague Brenda will talk about later today. So let me just end with this thought. Why is cultural heritage and climate change so important to connect together? I think what it does is it connects climate change to places that we love and care about. It bridges space and time by showing that climate change is happening here in places that we know about and care about, and it's happening now, not in some future place. And I guess I'll leave you, I always try to leave people with an image to raise their sense of urgency. And for this particular group, if I were a historic preservationist, probably what would keep me up at night is the image of the bulldozer about to raise an historic building, or an excavator about to dig up some archaeological site. And once that bulldozer is at the doorstep, or the excavator is there, there's really not much more you can do. And I would encourage all of you to think about climate change as hundreds of thousands of bulldozers and excavators all over the world. And the hardest part is we don't know exactly which bulldozer or which excavator is going to strike. We don't know where it's going to strike. We don't know exactly when, but they're coming, and we've got to stop them before they get to our doorstep. So I hope that you can find some ways today to work together to raise the level of ambition and swiftly accelerate the pace of change before that bulldozer, before that excavator destroys the sites we care so much about. Thank you very much.
We're next going to have a presentation from a representative of Historic Environment Scotland. Historic Environment Scotland is the National Heritage Authority for the Government of Scotland. Your program says that we're meant to have Ewan Hislop, but Ewan had a mishap, and for some organizations that might mean that they simply couldn't show up today. But Historic Environment Scotland is special in a way in that it is perhaps, it is for sure one of the most engaged heritage authorities in the world on the topic of climate change. And so rather than not be here, even though Ewan couldn't make it, our next presenter, David Harkin, found himself unexpectedly on a plane from Edinburgh. And so David, thank you for arranging your affairs so that you could be here. I wouldn't normally linger on somebody's job title, but I just want to tell you David's job title. His job title is Climate Change Scientist for the Conservation Directorate of Historic Environment Scotland. So let me just ask to the U.S. State Historic Preservation Officers, the City Historic Preservation Officers, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers that are in the room or viewing through the live stream, who is the climate scientist on your staff? And you might say, oh, well, why? We don't have a climate scientist on our staff. Historic preservation organizations don't have climate scientists on their staff. Well, no, they do. And David incarnate the idea that climate science is a core competency that historic preservation offices need. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you from Edinburgh, Scotland, David Harkin.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction there, Andrew. And like he said, this time last week I had no idea I was going to be here. Some last-minute arrangements put in place on Friday resulted in me on a plane on Monday morning. So yeah, it's been a bit of a blur since then, but here I am. So I was preparing this presentation 30,000 feet above Greenland just a few days ago. So yeah, I still can't quite grasp the fact that I'm here, but here I am. Ewan sends his most sincere apologies for not being able to make it, and like Andrew pointed out, the very fact I'm here should hopefully indicate how important we think the formation of this network is, and yeah, delighted to be here and delighted to be involved. So before I get into the main part of the presentation, I thought I would give you a quick overview of who Historic Environment Scotland are. So we are Scotland's lead public body for the historic environment. It is our mission to protect, conserve and manage the historic environment for the benefit of everyone in Scotland and for all our visitors that come and visit us every year. We have in our direct care over 300 properties of national and international significance, and associated with 170 of those properties is a collection of over 38,000 objects. Every one of those red dots is a property that we look after, so the remit is truly national. We cover every corner of the country, so to speak. And those properties represent over 5,000 years of Scotland's history. So from sites like Skara Brae, one of the best preserved Neolithic villages in Western Europe, through to places like Fort George, Edinburgh Castle and Holyrood Park. So there's a whole host of different properties there that we manage on behalf of the Scottish people. That is a really quick overview of who we are. And if you have any other questions, you can catch me later on. But we have 10 minutes to put across our points and to put across our thoughts on where we think our cultural heritage intersects with climate change. And I should point out that I'll use the terms cultural heritage and historic environment interchangeably. We usually refer to the historic environment, but they mean the same thing, essentially. So from our perspective, we think there's three key strands on this intersection, those being how we can learn from the past, how we can lead by example, and how our heritage and our cultural heritage can act as a change maker. So I'll explore these 3 points in just a little bit more detail. We'll start with point 1, learning from the past. And for us, we think this is all in the detail, or the detailing, so to speak. What do I mean by this? Well, our traditional buildings in Scotland were built with the climatic conditions in mind. So things like a pitched roof, overhanging eaves, drip moulds on windowsills, cast iron rainwater goods, these traditional features of a building all made it inherently resilient to the wet climate Scotland has. And where these features are looked after well and maintained properly, they actually give the historic environment a fighting chance, so to speak, in terms of being resilient to climate change. In Scotland, we're blessed with a rich geological history that means our properties are made from natural materials like stone and slate and whatnot. And these materials are, we're looked after properly. These materials are very resilient to climate change. But that's the sort of micro scale elements, if you will, so the elements that are specific to the buildings themselves. But there's a macro scale element to this too, and that our ancestors were very clever in where they decided to build properties. So this is Cohern Castle in the west of Scotland. And recently we we started a process to identify what sites of ours are at risk from climate change and in what way. And to start this process, we looked at natural hazard risk, so risk from things like flooding, coastal erosion, and landslides. And during this process, we kept finding examples where our sites were being flagged up as being at high risk, but in actual fact, the monuments themselves were not. And Cohern demonstrates this really well. So if I zoom in a little bit, the red line is the extent of the area that we look after. So it's much bigger than the monument itself. And the little dry patch in the middle is where the castle is. So during a flood, this is a flood map I should point out, during a flood, the castle itself is actually high and dry, but the ground about it is wet. So there's something that we can learn from that surely, and think about how and where we build currently. If you dig in, I like this, if you dig in to a bit more detail, what you find is that Cohern Castle was actually built on an island, but now you can walk to it, it's connected to the mainland. So the little blue circle there, the circle there shows you Cohern Castle as an island in the 1500s. So that map was drawn by someone called Timothy Pont back then. So what our sites have and what we have at Historic Environment Scotland is a unique appreciation of time, and that we care for over 5,000 years of Scotland's history. And the climate has changed during that period and will change again. So we have a sort of unique view on what the impacts of that change will be, and we can use this to help inform future practices. I'll move on to the second point, leading by example. And I'll start with this phrase because I think it's something that we've probably all heard before, that you can't make an older building resilient or warm to the climate. They're old and drafty. But actually that couldn't be further from the truth. And leading by example, this is Edinburgh Castle, a world famous iconic landmark. And in 2008, 2009, we started a process of upgrades and improvements to the castle to improve the energy efficiency of it. And I should note that Edinburgh Castle is not one building, it's 28 different buildings that range in age from over 900 years old to stuff built in the 20th century. It welcomes over 2 million visitors a year now, so it supports an infrastructure that welcomes 2 million people a year. And for a castle that was designed to keep people out, that's quite an impressive achievement. So since then, so through things like boiler upgrades, better use of insulation, changing staff behaviour, things like that, the castle has actually reduced its energy consumption by 33%, which is a 31% reduction in emissions. The initial 400 or just under £400,000 investment was paid back within 5 years, and now the castle is into true savings. So the money being saved through lower energy bills actually is money in the castle's pockets, essentially, that can be used to improve the conservation and maintenance of the property. And these figures are actually 1 year out of date now. My colleagues recently put together the figures for 2017, 2018, and the emissions have now gone down to, have gone up to a 40% reduction. So that's quite impressive for an old drafty building. So what this should hopefully show people is that if we can do it at a site like Edinburgh Castle, then they can do it at their traditional constructed homes and flats and things like that. And that's really important in Scotland because 1 in 5 dwellings were built pre-1919 and are considered traditional. So that's almost 500,000 houses in Scotland that have a key role to play in helping Scotland achieve its really ambitious climate change targets. I should say that Scotland has some of the most ambitious climate change targets in the world, which we're very proud of. So the historic environment has to play a role in that if those targets are to be met. Final point, it's part of our DNA, our cultural heritage, it's part of our DNA. What do I mean by this? Well, it's part of our everyday lives in Scotland. It's everywhere, it's in every corner you turn. It's almost hard not to encounter some form of cultural asset on your day-to-day lives when you're walking around the streets of Scotland. This is Easter Road in Edinburgh. I live in a flat just off to the left of this image, and what you can see there are traditionally constructed tenements, an old Victorian school at the top of the street, and all that's overshadowed by Holyrood Park in the background. That's Salisbury Crags. That's the volcanic city centre of Edinburgh. So that's in Scotland, that's the historic environment. That's what people deal with every day, and the castles and the standing stones that people visit as tourists are just part of that as well. So the historic environment is much more than the grand monuments like Edinburgh Castle. It's our homes, essentially. So the tenement I live in was built in 1901. So yeah, it's part of my everyday life, essentially. And to put that into numbers, so if you add up all those numbers, over 56,000 sites in Scotland are designated. But actually that only represents 5 to 10% of all known historic sites in Scotland, so 90 to 95% is undesignated. So that's a lot of places, that's a lot of historic sites. So it's truly woven into every aspect of our society in Scotland. And with that sort of presence, if you think back to points 1 and 2, leading by example and learning from the past, if we can showcase those 2 points in such a way that people stand up and take notice, then the historic environment is the change maker. It acts as a catalyst for change, essentially, in Scotland and in other countries throughout the world. So it's hard not to take note of it, and that's why it's crucial that it has a spot around every discussion on climate action. We think there's an interest out there for this sort of stuff. So back in May, we organised an event at our National Building Conservation Centre in Stirling. That's one of the images there. So we had 80 people turn up to hear from people like me, from people like Hannah, who's in the room as well, to hear what the cultural or the heritage sector in the UK and Ireland could offer other sectors in terms of climate action, so how to assess impacts from climate change, how to adapt to climate change. And it was for us, we thought a really well-attended event, a very engaged audience, a very diverse audience. And the tweets we sent out that day reached over 100,000 people. So as a note to everyone in the room today, there's an audience out there that want to hear about this stuff. And with the combined voices of everyone here and all the organisations we represent, then we can make a huge, big shout for that sort of stuff. And in the UK, we have the expertise as well. We have an engaged group of people. These are the speakers from that event. We have an engaged group of people who want to sort of disseminate this information and research out there, and we think people want to hear this, or we hope people want to hear this. I'll quickly just say, how do we maintain momentum or sustain momentum in Scotland? Well, like I sort of alluded to earlier, we're very fortunate in that the Scottish Government has given us an incredibly strong legislative foundation from which we can do our work. It doesn't make our job easier, but it makes our job possible, which I think is a very important sort of distinction there. So Historic Environment in Scotland, as identified as a lead public body in Scotland, has a mandate to tackle climate change under 3 themes. So that's mitigation, adaptation and sustainability. So yeah, we have this very strong legislative foundation from which we can do our work, and we're very fortunate in that sense. And in fact, the Minister for Energy will be speaking to you later on from the Scottish Parliament, which is incredible. I'll leave it there. That's enough of me rambling on. Thank you very much for listening. If you do have any other questions, please come up and speak to me later.
Over the years, I've had the privilege of occasionally representing the historic preservation movement and the cultural heritage sector at some international climate change policy processes, at the COP meetings that you've heard so much about. And I've consistently been struck by the absence of fellow travelers, the absence of the organized cultural heritage sector at those meetings. It's frankly been a little lonely. But at the same time, I've been consistently impressed by the engagement of Indigenous and traditional communities. Indigenous and traditional communities are on the front lines of climate impacts, and they have been on the front lines of climate action. And consistently interwoven in their message has been a message of culture. And so, in a way, by supporting Indigenous and traditional communities, we are supporting climate action. And that is a lesson that I have learned from my brief forays into international climate policy. And we're lucky to have with us today one of the people that has been carrying that message in the United States, but really globally, Andrea Carmen, a member of the Yaqui Nation and the Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council. Andrea.
Respectful greetings to you, my relatives. I'd like to begin by recognizing the traditional peoples of this land, thanking the Muwek Maloney for their welcome and permission for us to be here. They've also given permission since 1979 for the International Indian Treaty Council to have what has been our main office here in San Francisco. I'd like to recognize just briefly our staff here, Janine Antoine and Morningstar Gali. Talk to them if you want to know anything about IITC's work in California and the Bay Area. I'd like to start with my opening slide, and there's a lot in here. First of all, we usually work at the international arena using the term traditional knowledge, but that often sounds like something that's frozen, like a thing. You know, here's indigenous people's traditional knowledge. And last year, I had the opportunity to be up at a traditional elders gathering for Treaty 1 through 11 in a very remote part of northern Canada, Ontario. And they used the term instead in English, translated from their language, our ways of knowing. And I thought that was much more powerful way to talk about the ongoing relationship of indigenous peoples with all of the things that make up our traditional cultures, our ways of life, what's called traditional knowledge, and also the core of what will be our and is currently now our resiliency to climate change with the ongoing learning and teaching that goes on. So I wanted to highlight that. But also this is a picture of that resiliency, but also the cultural and spiritual meaning for us of our traditional food. One of many examples I could give, this is a traditional corn altar for the first International Indigenous Peoples Conference on Corn that was hosted by the Zapoteca peoples in Oaxaca a few years ago, and it shows the 4 sacred colors that are universal to indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, the black, white, yellow, and red, the 4 directions, the 4 races of humanity as well, but also the basis of our biodiversity and our ability to adapt traditionally to changing climate and what will be the core of our ability to adapt as we move forward. Just a word about International Indian Treaty Council. We were formed in 1974 on the Standing Rock Reservation. Everybody's heard of Standing Rock now, if maybe not a couple of years ago. We were the first indigenous organization to have consultative status, recognized with the UN Economic and Social Council. And starting in 2011, we were the only indigenous organization to be recognized with general consultative status. And one of our founding principles that we continue to work based on, as including at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is that indigenous peoples speak for and represent themselves before the world community. We are the experts on our rights, our struggles, and the knowledge, our ways of knowing that we can contribute to these dialogues going on today. This is just 2 of our youth speaking as an example of this at a forum on youth, indigenous youth and access to justice at the UN Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Geneva a couple years ago. There were 22 and 16. As Karima, who we've worked for on some of the cultural rights issues for indigenous peoples at the UN, recognized this is a human rights issue that we're talking about. A rights-based approach is how we approach this as well. This is just one example in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being, important concept, well-being of himself and his family, including food. It's one of our California Indian representatives, just full of well-being. That's a beautiful picture of well-being. Her fish is great. We also have had the opportunity internationally working with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization as well as indigenous peoples around the world to define what is the right to food and food sovereignty for indigenous peoples. And This is something that came about in 2002. We had the first global consultation in Guatemala and came up with the Declaration of Atitlan that said the denial of the right to food denies us our physical survival, social organization, cultures, traditions, languages, spirituality, sovereignty, and total identity. And that's why we continue to challenge this, what we feel, even though we have to deal with it in all these UN bodies, this false distinction between what they call tangible and intangible cultural heritage. For us, that is a distinction that has no meaning in our culture. I'll just throw that out there. This is the Gwich'in Singers, Arctic Village, Alaska. And their clothes are made from caribou, their drums are made from caribou, they're singing a song to tell the caribou how to return, and we've just had a beautiful meal of caribou, but also their creation story tells how they were created from the caribou, and the caribou were created from them. I know you all have your bedside copy of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so I don't need to go into a lot of detail, but when we talk about rights for Indigenous peoples at the UN, we now have a minimum standard. These are the 30 years that it took to adopt the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, starting in 1977, entering into the United Nations for the first time. Many of our founders are there, and then the adoption in September 2007 of the UN Declaration. And just a few highlights. Like I said, the UN Declaration is the minimum standard. We can't go below that. It is the recognized international minimum standard for the rights, survival, and dignity of Indigenous peoples. It recognizes traditional knowledge in Article 31, our right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage, including seeds, knowledge of flora and fauna, and our Indigenous sciences. It's very important. A lot of times science is considered the Western model, and we just have traditional knowledge, some kind of folkloric way of understanding, but we do have science, and that is recognized at the United Nations. Our spiritual relationship with our traditional lands and resources. This picture is right out here on Alcatraz Island. You're all invited on October 8th to the next sunrise gathering on Alcatraz. We have the right to environmental protection and the productive capacity of our lands. We have the right to our subsistence and traditional economies. We also have the right to free, prior, and informed consent before development takes place that affects our traditional lands and territories. And that's very key for the resistance to the continuing causes of climate change. This, of course, is the Keystone XL pipeline protests in South Dakota. The threats to our traditional ways of life, our food sovereignty, and our ways of knowing has been already discussed and is well known. This is the infamous tar sands, Alberta, Canada. This is just one example, and I don't have time. I could give 100 examples from Indigenous peoples, but this is lesions on salmon in 2015 was presented at COP21. They lost 80% of their salmon run because of the warming waters and the impacts on the salmon trying to travel through the warmer waters. And the UN Rapporteur on Right to Food has said that climate change constitutes the single most important threat to food security in the future, just to note that. This is a slide prepared by Saul Vicente's organization. The red areas show where corn doesn't grow in the traditional areas of Mexico, including the area right on the left is our traditional lands, and of course up into Arizona of the Yaqui Nation. The fires, you know, we're here in California. We know about these things and the effect of the dying forests, and also the extreme weather events. This is Borean cane. And this is an important issue. Two places, Alaska and Tuvalu, where Indigenous peoples are facing forced eviction from their traditional homelands. And it's important to think about what will be the identity, the political identity of Indigenous peoples that are forced to become migrants and lose their self-determination. It's important that we look at the solutions from the point of view of Indigenous peoples. This is seed trading. We traditionally traded with each other. Many indigenous peoples have drought-resistant varieties that now we need in our homelands again. This is Oklahoma, seed trading among indigenous peoples from Mexico, Guatemala, and Oklahoma. The restoration of the buffalo is very key in this continent as resistance to climate change. This is just one example. In South Dakota, a couple years ago, there was a freak out-of-season blizzard in September, and about 100,000 cattle died. But you know how many buffalo died? None. Not one single buffalo died. So this is a source of resiliency, both cultural and as a resistance to climate change. Protecting sacred areas and sacred places. The Tule here in California are a source of cultural important ways of being. These are children learning to gather a traditional Tule canoe, but also they're along the wetlands. And my brother, who was going to be here, but he's on a ACORN and climate change, he's a climate scientist as well, said the Tule marshes absorb more than 10 times the carbon that a pine forest does. And these are where the sacred sites are too, the shell mounds right here in the Bay Area. So this is just one example of climate resistance as well as climate justice and cultural protection. Restoring ecosystems, this is in the Pacific, replanting the traditional plants that held the moisture in the roots, and of course elders teaching our youth about these traditional ways of knowing and how to adapt. This is Alaska and Arizona. That's my husband, by the way. Very important. Coal is the liver of Mother Earth. This is Roberta Blackgoat. And our prophecies from many, many ages ago talk about how to take care of the land and the importance of leaving things like coal in the earth. She was talking about climate change here, traditional ancient knowledge, and that's our climate science. Just really briefly, I know I'm almost out of time, but I need to tell you what's happening at the United Nations. This is COP21. We had to protest. We had to protest to get human rights recognized and indigenous rights recognized in the, for the first time in a legally binding environmental instrument at the UN. We took information from over 300,000 indigenous grassroots peoples that affirmed that traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples is important in addressing and responding to climate change. And this helped us not only to get the rights of indigenous peoples recognized in the Paris Agreement, again based on the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also set up a new traditional knowledge exchange platform that is currently under development. The states and climate scientists finally recognize the value of indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge, and we're working to see how this is going to work out with a rights-based approach with free, prior, informed consent. This is just one of the dialogues we've had with states. This is in Ottawa, Canada. There's another one coming up hosted by Bolivia in another month. But at the end of the day, and this is, I'm concluding, the end of the day, the most important is making sure that the voices of our traditional practitioners, farmers, hunters, gatherers, fishers, spiritual leaders, and elders get heard in these international dialogues as the basis. And this is one of many gatherings. This is one we just had 2 weeks ago in Oaxaca, respecting our science and ways of knowing indigenous peoples, food sovereignty, traditional lifeways, and climate change. And this is some of the participants. And I'll just end by quoting the declaration that came out because it's the basis, I think, for our understanding and for future work. We recognize the extreme crisis that we are facing through our indigenous science and ways of knowing and the realities we are living on the ground. If we agree to share this knowledge for the good of all humanity, it must be based on respect for our rights and the commitment by countries to implement real change in their methods of production and concepts of development. Chokwe Otesia, thank you very much.
For our final speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce James Grabert from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The UNFCCC is the United Nations global agency for climate change. It's where the world assembles to talk about climate change, and we're thrilled that James could make it from Bonn, Germany, to be with us today. Although I learned today, James, that you're actually a son of Louisiana. So it's good to have a Louisianan with us as well. James?
Thank you, Andrew. And yes, I'm from southern Louisiana. I'm a Cajun, as they would say, from the swamps of south of New Orleans. So there's a lot of interaction there on climate and heritage as well. But that's not what I'll be speaking about today, though. So first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to all of you today. When I was asked to look at this intersection, I thought perhaps the best way is to say a bit about where the nations are in their efforts to address this issue, and in doing so, maybe reflect of how this issue on cultural heritage should be integrated, is being integrated adequately, or not. So let me first start by saying your efforts show that the scale and scope of climate change are becoming understood clearly. What needs to follow is effective, sustained response on the scale and scope that is required to avoid the worst effects of climate change for the present and future generations. Let's consider for just a second what I just said, particularly the last part, present and future generations. I think that's the key here. When we talk about generations, we clearly are talking in a significant measure about heritage. What has to be left behind? What are we doing to do that? How are we going to ensure that we leave at least as good as we have it in respect to our heritage? The nations of the world are striving, I would say, to leave behind a livable planet, one of diversity and abundance. That's kind of what you read in between the lines in the spirit of the Paris Agreement. But it also should be done in a way that preserves heritage, our cultural heritage. The Paris Agreement, along with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, they form a coherent expression of the people's aspirations for their own well-being on this planet, including the future generations again, and the well-being of the Earth itself. We need broad-based mobilization of effort and resources to address climate change and to implement these three agreements I just referred to. But it needs to be at least done in a way that preserves, protects, and builds our heritage. So, what is the challenge? Well, obviously, we in UN Climate Change often say this is the challenge of our time. That might sound like a hyperbole to some people. After all, the world is facing severe problems with respect to war, poverty, disease, hunger, habitat loss, many. The list could be long and scary. There are many things we're dealing with on this planet. But we like to say that, this is the challenge of our time, because if you look at that list, if we address climate change, we can address some of those those other things. So it is important. Climate change is more frequent and more severe. We're seeing more frequent and more severe weather events, the longer droughts, the things you've already heard today, powerful hurricanes, fires, etc. In 2017, the disasters throughout the world were were quite significant, and again this year we're seeing much of the same. Probably this, I believe, is making it clear, more evident than ever, that this is something that we need to address quickly. It's affecting the people, the way they live, how they live, and is sending people on the move. It's creating these kind of issues, which also have a drastic impact on our heritage, our cultural heritage. So if we just hope this will go away, it won't happen. We're not going to just look out the window one morning and things will suddenly be back as they were. Things will change, we will lose, we will experience the worst of things if we don't address this. It's incredible the scientific source at our disposal tells us one thing, that we have to act now, as I've said. That's what the studies, that's what the science is telling us. The impacts are not going to get better, they're going to get worse, even as we make our efforts to deal with this now. So it's time for all the people to open their eyes and face the reality, and I'm glad to see that we're all here on board. In this summit here this week, these gatherings like this today are very, very encouraging, and it shows the importance. But what needs to be done? Well, we have a short period of time, as I said, to make the changes that are pledged under the Paris Agreement to limit the temperature rise and save our planet from the irreversible climate change damage that's happening. But are the nations, are they on track? No. I would say the nations are not on track presently. They perhaps are on track to implement what they've agreed in Paris, but Paris itself says we need more ambition. So we have to get onto that track. According to the 2017 GAP report of UNEP, what we've agreed so far is only going to get us about a third of the way there. So that means the gap between the reductions needed and the national pledges that have been made, there's still a significant gap, and this is not adequate. We're on a course, as you also heard earlier today, to 2.83 degrees if we don't do something. So this is not good enough. This will lead to global destabilization if we continue on this path. Destabilization across various spheres, economic, social, political, and cultural, of course. So it's clear what we need in our process is that the nations fully implement those pledges they have put on the table, their nationally determined contributions, and that they revise them and raise the ambition urgently. That's what's required in our process. So I don't want to scare everyone by these last few remarks about need for more action, because there is action happening. There is hope. I think we see here today, and you'll see all week long here during the summit, there's a lot of things happening. We have more than 90% of the parties have ratified the Paris Agreement. This shows an unprecedented political will, and cities, regional governments are coming together, as you've just heard, to tackle these issues, to find the solutions that we need. We have an ever increasing percentage of global economic leaders that are worth trillions of dollars that are taking climate action and making significant changes to the way they do business. We also have many nations developing bold plans to reach net zero emissions, also aligning their national laws to the Paris Agreement. We are phasing out fossil fuels-based vehicles in some areas. We have renewable power accounted for 70% of the net addition to global power in 2017. Record amounts of solar capacity and renewable power is being installed across the world. So there's a lot happening, but again, this isn't enough to reach our climate goals. We must increase our ambition. What we have isn't enough. The ambition has to be greater. There's not enough commitment, and there's not enough money being invested into these solutions to make the transformation to the low carbon future that we've set out in the Paris Agreement. So saying all that, I would ask the question is how are all these efforts that are being made, however, are they outlining adequately, and are they outlined adequately in a way that addresses the issues we're discussing today, the cultural heritage? I'll leave that to you to decide. The next 2 years are critical. You've heard that. We need to continue with the action that needs to be done. Now to get to the point of the intersections you were looking for. So I've said a lot about how things are happening at the subnational level, the business level, how communities are getting involved. But we have to make sure when that happens that it also has to take into account the human and cultural needs. We heard earlier today about the human rights, the human element of it. I think what's very important, and in the intersections I would then conclude on, is we talk about sustainable development, we talk about climate justice, and we talk about resilience. We look at those three things in our process at the international policy making level. How can you have sustainable development when we're really talking about human development? How can you have human development if you don't consider heritage? How can you have climate justice when you're not looking at the justice that the heritage deserves? And how can you not be considering resilience in terms of having heritage that is brought forward in a resilient manner? And I think you heard a number of examples today across adaptation and mitigation, how this can be done. So I'll leave it at that. I want to say, though, that the heritage actors have an important role. I lead the work in our organization on climate action, and we have a structure there and across various sectors and cross-sectoral topics, but yet we have a lot more space to provide, I think, to the indigenous people, to the cultural heritage issues. There needs to be much more done there as well. So I'm very proud to be here today, and I'm very glad to see the heritage actors are taking up this space, and applaud that. So I hope we can build a cleaner, greener, and more prosperous future while achieving our sustainable development goals and giving due respect to our cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. So we started off at this plenary session with the goal of mapping the intersection of cultural heritage and climate change. And so what did we find at the intersection? We found people, we found faith, we found castles, we found corn, we found caribou, we found thermal mass, we found a lot of things. And so I hope you are starting to see how your expertise, as your skills connect to the need for climate action, how you can help mobilize the cultural heritage sector for climate action.